That would have been a pretty good part of town if the roads were brick. I think otherwise they would have just been mud.
You see these towns today they're completely sanitized and, polished up. I think the towns were probably a lot dirtier. People were dirtier. The streets were dirtier.
Like modern architecture doesn't incorporate animals decoratively.
No, because ornament is crime in modernism.
I see something that characterizes the architecture of London. If you see the yellow, that's stock brick. But that London stock brick was a handmade brick that most of London was built out of in the 1800s before they moved to like a manufactured brick.
By 1868, it would have been factory produced.
It would have been started.
Right.
Oh, I just love the reference to both wind and steam in the ships.
The Industrial Revolution's going full bore at this time, right? All of the industry would have been powered at that time probably by steam. It's a little too early for widespread use of electricity, or even any electricity. I'm sure. Yeah, there's a big boiler.
Yep.
Coal-powered.
Oh, industrial architecture of London and the standing seam roof.
Yeah, lead, probably, or copper.
Yeah, that looks like lead. What part of London do you think we're in? We're right near the Thames.
Definitely. It's one of the bridges.
Oh, there's Big Ben, right? In Westminster. I don't think this is Westminster Bridge, though. I think that one...
Is this before the Tower Bridge? Might be a little bit before it.
Those are interesting. The lions, those are all over London. They're like a mooring ring.
The Tower Bridge was filled after this.
It was?
Tower Bridge was built around close to the turn of the century. This is a suspension bridge. Is this meant to be in America, in the American colonies?
So now we're in the New World.
We're in the New World. Yep.
Yeah, redcoats. I think my reference to this time, if this is 1700s, or this is revolutionary, I'm thinking of Paul Revere's house in Boston, but that's 1600s.
Yeah, but some of that would have been left. Some of this. What year is he supposed to be? 17?
Revolutionary time.
1770, revolutionary time. Yeah. Some of these buildings would have been built at that point, maybe 50, 100 years prior.
Sort of like a weather vane, but across.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of TikTok videos of people doing that exact jump off of the Burj Khalifa with parachutes.
It's interesting, this sort of pastiche of brick and wood house. I could buy it. I'm not sure. I'm not from the East Coast.
Looks pretty accurate to me.
Oh, I just saw the British flag. Interesting.
Sure. Would have been England then.
Exceedingly difficult roofs to climb. Luckily, there's corn everywhere. You think they would have bricked in the roads? I mean, that would have been a pretty good part of town if the roads were brick. I think otherwise they would have just been mud.
The buildings would have been a mixture of German and Dutch and English and all the different colonies, colonial influences. And then you get to like a pretty subtle level of detail, the difference between that. Like, is that Dutch or is that German? I'm not sure.
To me, these look like they have English influence, but I could be wrong. That's pretty good with the wood shake on the roof.
They also might have been slate tiles at that time.
If you could afford it. I'm sure wood was way cheaper.
Yeah.
So when was the Georgian period? King George was the problem for America. So there's the Georgian period of architecture. There were like 4 King Georges, so it spans a big period. Very symmetrical period in architecture.
I think of it as having a kind of box shape with a lot of chimneys on top, but symmetrical.
I think it was all related to golden ratio too. So, and very much based on Palladio, perhaps. So there was like a very specific conversation about symmetry and proportion.
Sure. And Christopher Wren would have been an influence at that time. He was kind of notable for Georgian architecture.
But in England, not in the US, right?
He did design a building in the United States at a college back east.
So we're in a port town. More corn.
If my history serves me, this happened in New England. Yes, upper New England and Canada.
I do think of those fences with the different levels of spikes as very colonial.
I'd like to hear costume designers react to this.
Yeah, totally. But it's interesting how they're backlit, like they're cutouts. That's how you know they're expendable. They're slightly two-dimensional. What town do you think we're in?
Oh, I don't know. Boston.
Massachusetts. That's what I was.
Halifax.
I like that you see smoke on all the chimneys, because at that time, everyone would be using them to cook.
Yeah, they're kind of terracotta tiles. Maybe.
Yeah, I was wondering about those too. They look like a clay tile. I mean, this seems legit too, where you would have these older sort of stockadey kind of structures potentially intermixed. And this is pre-revolution.
It's a lot of buildings that were probably built in those towns that there's no trace of them anymore. And those towns were new, right? Like, so they probably built, there was a barn next to the courthouse, next to the church, next to the tavern, next to the slave owner's mansion, or would have been like the kind of rules of city building weren't totally laid out yet.
That's an interesting point, is that you don't see any evidence of slavery, which there would have been at this time.
The kind of idea of colonialization is not evidenced in the environment of the game. I don't know if it's in the content of the game, like in the story of the game, but the environment doesn't seem to address it.
I guess we're not going in there. I'm curious what that was. It was almost castle-like.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't seem accurate.
It doesn't seem like something you would see in an American colony. It was a lot more humble. It was Calvinist Protestants who had very unpretentious architectural leanings, not something that would have that kind of ornamentation on it.
What is that guy doing?
Yeah, he's the town drunk. You see these towns today they're completely sanitized and, polished up because that's a kind of historical relic. I think the towns were probably a lot dirtier. People were dirtier. The streets were dirtier.
What do you think that sidekick right there is for that we're climbing up on?
That's a scupper.
Is it a hoist?
Maybe.
That's how you get your cross up there? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That looks like a Dutch tower.
Oh, cool. That's amazing. That boat is extraordinary. Oh, that's cool too, how they got the painting. Because, traditionally Egyptian architecture was colorfully painted. That's so pretty. What's he looking for? I like how the style of the map matches the architecture. I also like how they used a lot more animals in architecture back then. Like all the birds so far holding up all the fireballs.
I think that's an Egyptian thing. Animals had like a mythical mythology.
Historically in architecture, I was in London last week, and you'll see a lot more animals being incorporated in, even just in residential. Like, one of them's got lions and one of them's got hawks. I think you see it less in the States and modern architecture doesn't incorporate animals decoratively.
No, because ornament is crime in modernism.
That's interesting. I never thought about Egyptians having urns with plants growing out of them like that. There's been such a trend lately towards people wanting plants and things. I wonder if that's happening in video game as well.
I'm sure it is. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like the idea of the potted plant, like look at the planter box there on the left.
Those look like somniferum poppies.
Are those something you'd see in the Nile?
I don't know, but they grow in Afghanistan a lot, right? That's where the poppy trade is.
Now we're in the bazaar. Yeah, it looks a little art directed, you know, like these pots. I'm guessing that they wouldn't have had them.
I mean, maybe they, yeah, probably not. Probably it was a lot of work to make an urn and you're going to keep it for wine. But I like the idea. I mean, Egyptians were all about creating gorgeous objects and gorgeous spaces. So maybe they did landscape them somehow. This is cool. Okay, so we're out near the pyramids.
We're on the tombs.
If this is ancient times, right around the end of BC, wasn't it supposed to be more fertile at that time too? When were the pyramids built? Because already this one is old enough to have a fair amount of decay. But it's still got, you know how now you see them and they look like articulated blocks? This one is still totally smoothed over. So it hasn't eroded yet, which makes it harder to climb.
Well, sure. This is supposed to be in 50 BC or something. The pyramids were already 3,000 years old at that point.
Okay. So that's very accurate.
It's always like kind of like a climbing wall for them. Like,
well, and always in video games too, you know, like if you can go that way, you have to check it out at some point.
You got to signal to the player that you can go up that.
Now that's cool with the gold on top. Wow. So this would have been during the Etruscan period.
If they're drawing for historic accuracy, there should be some pretty here known architectural types.
I mean, the clay tile's accurate. That was totally what they were using. There's like a big scaffold right there, but we decided to go up the side of the stone wall.
Thus far, it's that sort of generic game stone style.
It's like zoos and zoo rock. I agree. It's left pretty open-ended. And that's another thing. We're not seeing the expansive view either.
By this time, Greeks were planning whole cities. Their cities were highly developed. This is the peasantry living in these kind of places.
I think you're right.
Which is totally inaccurate.
Because it's pre-medieval, for sure. I mean, it makes sense that there's this sort of fort aspect to it because you would have wanted to protect yourself from invasion.
Now, here we go. Here we're getting into a temple.
Here's the temple. But that, to me, I don't know, were the Etruscans? Does that seem accurate? To me, that almost seems fancier than that time, but I could be wrong. I also appreciate that you get to see the color on this, too. And we're so used to looking at ruins that are just the color of the stone. And I never think about them having fire at temples. Oh, that was cool with the sort of murals inside with the Pompeian red. What is that called? Wattle and daub? The plaster technique?
Yeah.
Something like.
But is that something that was used in Mediterranean architecture? See, that's something that you don't really see because all of that stuff is deteriorated. I don't know what a humble farmhouse from that era looked like because we only see the temples. The temples are preserved. They're made of stone, but these kind of less ceremonial buildings, non-ceremonial, functional buildings, they don't exist anymore.
I kind of think London was pretty accurate. The sort of industrial architecture of that time in the mid-1800s. I love on the last two, the Egyptian and the Etruscan, the sort of recreation of the life that was in with all the color.
They're kind of speculating on how the temples would have been painted. They're probably speculating a little bit on how the common people lived. It's interesting to see that.
I think it's really interesting. Assassin's Creed does a dynamite job of hitting the sort of historical reality of the architecture. But it's interesting if you think about the actual concept of the game itself. Like, it's Assassin's Creed. So it's about being true to something. It's So I like the consistency throughout the game. For more experts react, check out Gameology's Facebook and YouTube pages. For more of me, check out Preen Inc. on Instagram.
For more of me, check out Ball Novez Studio on Instagram.
See you next time.